And we are recording. Okay. Hey, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Unplug IT. I'm your host, Stephen Rose, and thanks for joining us. If you're watching us on YouTube, hey, give us a subscribe or give us a like. We love hearing from you and how everything is working out for you, and if we're hitting all the right topics, and if there's something you'd like to hear about. I've been at a few conferences recently, and I hear a lot kind of in three areas. Number one, um, you know, are some of these technologies going away? Are things like OneNote and SharePoint, are they still going to be viable in the future? And we'll come back to that in a minute. A lot about how we measure success as we take a look at Copilot. And then the third one is, hey, what do you think of these fancy new Copilot AI PCs? So I went out and I bought one. I got the new Surface with the fancy Copilot button and all of that stuff. And the problem that I'm having is a lot of the services that are going to leverage this are just not available yet. They're not out in the versions of Windows that I'm running. So, from a hardware standpoint, it's great. But from am I seeing a difference as I leverage AI? I'm not seeing that yet. So, at my last conference I was at the M365 conference, I ran into an old friend, Richard Harbridge, and we thought it'd be great to talk about exactly that. Why does SharePoint still matter in this era of Copilot? So, without any further ado, I will bring in Richard, who is joining us today from a little outside of Toronto in an area I know quite well. He gets the joy of being able to go to the Hockey Hall of Fame and at Tim Hortons whenever he wants, which I cannot. How are you, Richard?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me, Stephen.
Awesome. So a little bit about you. You are CTO of the to lead company. Kind of give us a little bit about that company, what you're doing there. I know you're also a Microsoft MVP, so kind of take a minute or two and walk us through who you are.
Sure. So I work in the space of technology road mapping a lot of times with customers. That's what I do most of my day to day. And nowadays, that's all AI. It's AI employee experience roadmaps. It's AI, internet roadmaps. It's AI, document management, document processing, and automation roadmaps, and so on and so forth. So that's been really enjoyable. And I'm joined by an amazing team of other MVPs, and we do Microsoft technology consulting services with customers. And we're lucky because we've been able to be part of Copilot in its preview days to all the way till now. And, that yo-yo of like, here's the promise of the value that you're going to receive. And then here's like the reality as people use it is definitely something we've been on that roller coaster. And so it'll be a fun topic for discussion today.
Cool. I know folks can find you on LinkedIn if they want to find more about the company. What's the best URL for them to go to?
To lead.com, the number 2, TOLEAD.com.
Awesome. So trends. As I sit down with so many different customers that I'm working with, and you and I do some overlap things. You do a lot of process automation, some of the migration. We both do kind of digital workplace user adoption, employee experience, and how to bring that to life. There are two or three trends that I'm seeing. Number one, companies are not ready for Copilot. They still don't have all their content in the cloud. They don't have it organized. I've said this many times, good Teams usage equals good, will equal a good Copilot experience. And people are still just using group chats, not really,
Like
sharing
channels.
files, doing
Yeah.
that. Are you seeing the same thing with your customers as well?
Absolutely. So, there's sort of two layers to it, right? There's the technical readiness. So you've got this security debt, you've got consolidation debt, to your point, legacy systems, things like that, and they have to tackle some of that debt in order to realize optimal value. It's not like you can't realize some value, but again,
Right.
it makes a big difference, especially with risk mitigation. As you use these tools, your content creation using these generative tools often exponentially increases. So you're increasing the velocity, the variety, the volume, and those things create more risk. So it's important to address some of those risks early because there really is a more pronounced and more costly effect if you roll these technologies out without labels and some of these other things in place. And then there's the other side, to your point, the business readiness. And, even customers that have pretty good business readiness, they have, communities, they've got champion programs. When you
Right.
look at them deeper, you realize many of the champions are non-peer, right? They're IT or they're managers, or you run into this other issue where they have these scaffolding patterns, right, for business support, but they've never done technology that doesn't really stop, right? Because AI and especially these tools, the way that they work is every month there's major updates and new
Right.
improvements. And so it's very much exponential curve. And since there's no plateau, that makes it much harder operationally to figure out the right funding programs and structures. And
Right.
so I think a lot of that is customers catching up there.
And let me take a step back with that. When we talk about change champions, for those of you that are new to this, ideally, it should be having someone who represents every job function within the company, being trained as your expert on that. And then that becomes the person that other people go up to when they have questions. And the key in doing that, rather than the way that Richard was saying a lot of companies are, is if somebody says, yeah, but that doesn't work for my job, it's somebody saying, yes, I do your job. It does work. Here's how it's going to change it. And it brings in more comfort to those users. It brings in that there's a connection there. And it also allows them to tell you how you may have to tweak that workflow for that division of a company based on how they're working, where they're working. And it makes it easier to track that change. Um, which brings me to a good question, and this is something that I get asked a lot, and that is, I tell anybody before you're going to spend that money. And by the way, if you've not yet purchased Copilot, you have to pay for 1 to 3 years in advance every seat you're going to use. So you are paying from that from the moment you buy it. Hence, why you want to kind of prepare for it before you do that. But the most important thing, and I think and tell me if you feel this is the same, Richard, I think is before you do any of this, you have to understand not only what does success look like. It is getting 20% of our people to do this, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, but being able to track it and actually see, are people using this? Are we invoking change? Who's using it? Who's not? If they're not, why? That really becomes a key piece of the separate sauce of the secret sauce. And there's several tools in being able to do that. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, the first one that's easy, everyone understands, is like measuring productivity gains, right? Because that's low hanging fruit. It's
Right.
relatively easy to do. Microsoft actually does a lot of assistance to help you with that. The scenarios you're mapping to are almost always exclusively productivity scenarios at the beginning. So, in all of those ways, productivity is a big metric, and it's not minor, right? Like there are customers that have 300% productivity gains. We have 120% as the average that we see of productivity gains as a flat number, like across customers.
Right.
So those are pretty easy numbers to meet, and that's pretty substantial in its impact. Which is why, even though it's expensive, the return on investment is very high, and so you can use it as a carrot to pay for those technical debt, security
Right.
debt, those other issues, which is great. Migrations, you name it. The other side of it, though, is once you've measured productivity gains, you start to get into quality gain measurements, and quality gain measurements are just much better, right? So if you take something simple like we're writing proposal documents, you think about like not just how long did it take before and how long does it take now, but you start to think about asking customers in different ways, like or prospects, was the quality of this higher? Did you like that it
Right.
was more personalized to you? Things that you can do now because you have these AI tools to help personalize, to align it, et cetera. And of course, you look at win rates and things like that too. And you combine that data across this productivity metric, and you get what we call quality metrics. And those quality metrics are the real magic for measurement, because productivity is a really good baseline, and it helps us understand baseline adoption. Are people getting exposed to it? Are they using it more frequently? Because again, frequency of usage matters, et cetera there. But the
Right.
other piece to it, I think that's everyone's working towards and trying to achieve, is those quality metrics. And those are nice because they also align with the same way we measure what we call functional agents or more verticalized copilots. So if
Mhm.
you're using Dynamics copilots, because of course there's like 100 copilots. So if you use other copilot or AI experiences, their measures, of course, their productivity ones, they all do, but the quality gains are the ones that the reason
Right.
customers invest those substantial numbers into those. So yeah,
And
I
I
think
want to take a
quality
look.
is the other key metric people
It
just
is,
don't quite get
absolutely, and
to.
I wanna take a look at the dashboard in a minute, but I think it's interesting 'cause one of the things that I told a client of mine is, "Look, there are basically 2 different types of Copilot actions. There's consume and there's create. Consume are the ones you can do even if your content's not all in the cloud. Look at this email thread, summarize it. Look at this document, summarize it. Take this document, and whatever, do this with it. As opposed to, hey, summarize the meeting for me or what I missed. That's a, create. Or, sorry, that's a consume, but create is okay. What are the follow ups? Who should I be reaching out to? All of that secondary stuff that unless you have everything in 365, unless you have it all cataloged and broken down, those are more advanced and not everybody can do because they're not in the same place. And I found that to be one of the easiest ways to talk about the different types of Copilot scenarios. So let's take a look at the Copilot dashboard. I know you have a few cool demos, so let me go ahead and add that to our stage. I will bump us over there. And for those who haven't seen it, if you have Copilot, you have this, you should go check it out. You just go to your dashboards, or you can go to aka.ms/Copilot dashboard. There's a whole bunch of different things that you can do to go check it out. But this is part of Viva Insights. So that's kind of the key thing to know.
Yeah,
You want to have turned on Viva Insights. Yeah.
there's sort of two approaches, right? You either don't pay for Viva Insights, but you can still access this dashboard and it provides a lot of rich data, or you
Right.
pay for Viva Insights and it adds stuff to the dashboard. And we won't go into all of it, but to your point, understanding like what are the types of activities people are doing,
Right.
especially at scale, is really helpful. And basically, if you pay for either third-party tooling or you pay for Viva Insights, you can get more granular, where you can start to understand how that maps per population, right? So this set of users, like how do they work? And in fact, one of the ideas here is, let's talk about SharePoint. Of course,
Mhm.
SharePoint's a cornerstone for the technical readiness, right? We've already talked about labels and those things that people have to do, but it's also how a lot of people derive value, because we think of them as like Office applications. Oh, you use email, you use Word, you use PowerPoint, and you use Copilot within those experiences. But again, those are stored in SharePoint. And when you think about what we're showing here with data, is how people work with those documents. And surprisingly, a lot of this data is hard to get today. And a lot of customers, the very first time we start to roll a Copilot, they're like, huh, we didn't know people created so many documents, right? We,
Right.
we just never thought about those types of metrics before. So I think one of the things that's really great about learning about this, just like the carrot can drive investment, of AI can drive investment in those technical elements, it also can be quite nice in terms of like opening up eyes in terms of what data you might have but you're not using today. And my favorite example of this is when you get into the impact. So I'm going to shift away from, these are free reports that you get,
Mhm.
everyone has access to if you have one license of Copilot and beyond. But
Right.
as we dig into like things like the impact is really designed based on this idea of you having Viva Insights, which is $4 user per month, or you can buy the $6 one with Glint and all that. And
Right.
that capability set here gives us this richer understanding, because when we dive into these actions, the things that have been taken with those documents, we can really narrow down based on groups, based on comparisons, and compare different groups. We can really get a lot more granular. And this is something where you think about the behavioral metrics that's existed in Viva Insights for quite some time, but many organizations just have never invested into those layers. And as you use AI tools, to your point, digital excellence, digital fitness, whatever we want to call it, becomes a higher priority, right? Because we
Right.
recognize if we're investing, $30 is not cheap per
No.
user, right? Then we know that we need to spend, some consumption around adoption and other things around that. And so there's sort of two layers to this. There's the metrics that it gives you. This is just like the document related ones.
Right.
These are the metrics that you get for Copilot, right? So these are Copilot data points that you can compare against. And then the other one, that I didn't quite have in my demo here, is the behavioral metrics, where you can understand like how are people working on documents
Right.
within Viva Insights. And together, those two lenses really give us this ability to better understand, what the opportunity space is for things like process automation. Think of like all those years of, metadata matters, and, the folders are the F word and all that other stuff. We've all been championing, some change there. Now
Right.
it's possible to really start to illustrate, opportunity space that exists. If you see a lot of people generating content, right, using Copilot, remember that's one-off experiences. It's not truly automated, right?
Right.
Whereas if you take SharePoint Premium, or you take, other capabilities in the Microsoft stack, templates, you name it, all of a sudden those investments on knowledge management, information architecture, or advanced solutions like SharePoint Premium are a lot easier to understand and consume, and even target within groups in the organization. So that's been a really exciting time as well.
I love that. You mentioned SharePoint Premium, so let's talk a little bit about that. So once again, we have another another Copilot that you have to pay for, another premium product you have to pay for. First of all, what is the difference between SharePoint and SharePoint Premium?
Yeah, so SharePoint is our content services layer. So
Right.
all the content that powers Copilot, not just like the meetings, not just the emails, but the rest of the content that's document related, especially, that stuff is stored and lives in SharePoint, along with your intranet and other resources like that. So that's important. However, what you essentially have is you have this gap where SharePoint does a lot, but it doesn't quite do things like document processing, AI, to consume documents and auto assemble them and generate them, doesn't look at things like clause analysis, in one contract versus another. Oh, there's a risk here. It needs to be, captured and escalated, or extract the date from this document, not just like have the metadata available so people can fill it out, but automatically extract the due
Right.
date for an
Making the
NDA
data
so that we have
intelligent.
that, escalation. So there's what we call document processing. There's a lot of stuff it does there. It used to be called Syntax, and before that, Project Cortex, under Microsoft terms. And then we have this other area, which is advanced management. And that's like the governance piece, right? So when you roll out something like Copilot for Microsoft 365, everyone has the same issue. There's oversharing, content and spaces aren't well managed. And
Right.
so we have to remediate that, or at least come up with a scalable, programmatic style approach that allows us to scale. And when we tackle those things, then it becomes really important to essentially address it using tools. And so Microsoft has these first party tools there, which used to be, you'd have to buy a third party and do all that. Now more and more of those, not everything you need, but a lot of what you need is built into these first party tools under the same brand of SharePoint Premium. So think of it as making sense and organizing and working on your content and security stuff, as well as this other layer, which is like, how do I automate, the way I work with documents, and the processes around it. And those two things are where SharePoint Premium resides.
So this doesn't sound like something that everybody needs, but if you are a document heavy vertical like medical or legal or something like that, where you don't just want to be able to search your data, but make it intelligent, make it actionable, and actually create workflows or things like that that look for certain words and then kick things off with syntax, breaking all of that down. This sounds like something that they would need to be able to really use this as sort of a document management system, an intelligent document system to do that. Is that
I
the correct
I think it's
interpretation?
certainly more pronounced in some industries, but those industries also have other investments, so it's a more
Mhm.
complicated discussion. What I'd say is two things. One, the first question I get with Copilot when we start to talk about documents and SharePoint, because when we talk about SharePoint, we think about documents, right? We don't
Right.
really talk about pages as often. But when we talk about documents, what ends up happening is people go, "Oh, I'm going to use Copilot," and I get this all the time. I'm going to use Copilot, and I want it to create this document for me that's like this, like a standardized, contract, or this type, proposal, or a statement of work, or whatever. I want
Right.
it to look like this and be structured like that, and then I want it to be able to do this. And each time they describe these processes, I'm like, you could do that, as one-offs using Copilot. It's a good way to learn how Copilot works. But
Right.
fundamentally, what you're describing is something you want to automate, or at least have semi-automated. And
Right.
those two scenarios, the words automatic and semi-automatic, those are things that Copilot doesn't really do, because you're the
No.
pilot and it leans on the user to be able to steer it and direct it and do all that work. So I think that's the first thing, is SharePoint Premium applies to every org, because that question of how do we, with the same tooling that we have with Microsoft in a cost-effective way, how do we handle those types of automation scenarios? This is a pretty good answer and a pathway to explore. And then
Right.
the other side of it, to your point is, let's say we do map that. Once we understand that element of it, it's whether or not this is applicable for our business. And that's totally, you're right. It's a business case scenario. So,
Right.
in my particular business, I have a scenario and I want to automate it. The problem there is people think of the way the technology was. They don't think of how the technology is.
Right.
And this is one of those areas where I think the promise of value isn't, necessarily bad. It's quite pronounced, because this space has been maturing for years, and natural language makes it more accessible. You
Right.
get, instead of these really clunky, and not that you don't use these methods, but these clunky training models that, extract and analyze data, because that's what Microsoft's trying to do, is they're trying to take their AI services in Azure, and they're
Right.
trying to make them more consumable for like
Right.
business users or super users. Well, the thing is the most recent announcements they have with like autofill column, which it blends that natural language kind of Copilot like experience with SharePoint Premium, I think is a
Mhm.
really nice example of that. In fact, if you want, I can even show you a quick example of what I
Yeah,
mean by
please.
that. Yeah.
Let's jump over. So we'll go here to our stage.
So I've
Go
got a
for it.
little demo here. It's really straightforward. Essentially, what's happening is we're adding a column like we've all done to SharePoint libraries. And remember, metadata matters. It powers the Copilot experiences. So we're going to add this column, and this column is going to be basically a really simple choice column. And the column is going to be around readiness. Now, this is not your typical scenario. We're not taking contracts. We're saying we have these products, right, for a marketing campaign, and I want to determine if they have UV protection, vibrant colors, things that make them ready for a summer campaign. And so I use very natural language to say, evaluate this document. Does it contain these things? If so, make it these patterns, like assign this result of this column value. And then we apply it, and it's literally this easy. It's just very straightforward natural language writing. We apply it, and now it applies across those thousands of documents. Then what we can do is take that same approach and do it again for maybe, since that was like asking, does it contain these values? Does
Right.
it contain bright color, et cetera? Let's actually make that a description column. So we'll call it details, and then we'll fill in this automatic details column in the same way with natural language, and then it puts those down. And all of a sudden, something that you think of historically, why would we ever do document automation,
Right.
right? Becomes this really accessible and interesting pathway. And I think this is the real promise. It's not about, the things you've already invested probably as a company in AI solutions for contract processing and whatever. It's these newer spaces that are more accessible and cost effective to get this kind of intelligence. And these
Right.
are things you could do with Copilot today, right? I could say, Copilot, summarize this document. Does it contain these things? You know what I
Right.
mean? But it doesn't scale, right? The scaffolding, the programmatic nature of it, the automatic nature of it is something that I need another tool for. So I think that's a good example of Copilot and SharePoint Premium working well together.
Right.
Not that you require one or the other there; it's just the idea. And then that same sort of idea can also be used in other ways. So just some food for thought here, right?
And
Like you
and
could
one
use
more thing is that
SharePoint.
also is a no-code solution. We're not using, Power Apps or things like that where we could have done that through it. We're able to do this much simpler without having to go through all those extra steps
And
and
it's,
costs too.
it's to your point, it's not perfect, but if it can
Right.
handle some of those scenarios or at least inspire the business, then we can always use that extra layer of IT
Right.
support to take those solutions further or just improve their
Yeah.
accuracy or whatever it is that the remaining gap is. But I guess this is what I'm saying is the space feels like it's changing in a notable way.
Yeah.
And that's like an exciting prospect. So those are some angles and ways to think about SharePoint Premium for sure today.
Awesome. I love it. And then what were you showing there with the in that last slide? That was the last of the autofill
Yeah,
and what
just
we're
like
seeing there?
ideas of different ways to do it, right? So things like if a
Yeah.
number is this, then mark it as that. So I just want to make sure it's clear. Like when I said the prompt example, there's other
Right.
ways you could use the very natural language to write those prompts. And I'm excited about this. Just things like views and how people work with views and metadata are still a little tricky. Like conditional highlighting, there's things that people aren't really familiar with, but maybe familiar with in Excel or something. The same people who are using Excel now and they're doing those tactics using Copilot can then apply them in the SharePoint space potentially, right? So I think that's a nice bridge.
Mhm.
Again, it's the promise of value, kind of like your Copilot Plus laptop, and these are things we hope to see rationalized soon. But it's another example of something that is out there, and that we're waiting for it to land, so we can bridge that gap. Until then, yeah, there's lots of other ways to do these things, but they're not as easy or as accessible. Just like plugins, right, in SharePoint
Yes.
versus like the new SharePoint Copilot experiences.
I find it interesting you use the term promise of value. And that is, I think it's a great term because at its core, that's really what Copilot is. I have so many customers that are like, well, what about this functionality? Well, it hasn't quite hit yet, or it hasn't come out. Like I'm looking at Loop and half the page says not available when it comes to a lot of the management features. I mean, I'm looking, it's like not currently available, not currently available, not currently available. And it's that middle ground in how far do I go? There you like Excel and Copilot, there's not much there. And the same with Word. It's really limited. I know
I
Microsoft
think
has been focusing
so.
on
I
Teams and
hear what you're
Outlook.
saying because I felt
Right.
the same way, right? But I have,
Yeah.
I have to remind myself of this because we're super users, and actually, I think most people who watch this are probably super users too, right?
Yeah.
And I remind myself of this all the time because when we look at ROI across
Mhm.
customers and we take those champions, because champions are almost always super users too,
Yes.
what we find is the ROI is actually highest in people who are moderate or mid level or even
Right.
not digitally savvy.
Yeah.
Because the things you and I would do, we know what a lot of those commands are in the ribbon. Like we know how to do those things
Right.
quickly and easily. But surprisingly, a lot of people don't. And I think one of the things we underestimate is because these natural language processes are so easy to start with, you
Mhm.
see a lot of people doing what we think of as like a really basic presentation, but they never really created presentations before. And now they're
Fair enough.
doing that. Or another example, like the document scenario, again, remember we can template it, it can inherit templates. So there's work we need to do as businesses to support so this is more effective. But again, a lot of people have things like a series of emails or other things they want to collate, but they don't provide as like, a business document update or some other artifact or lessons learned from a project, you name it. There's so many different ways people can use these things where you grab different artifacts, different sources, the anything
Right.
to anything idea of AI and pull it together. And I think, the data in the research, like MIT, Harvard, et cetera, it's pretty clear. Like it's the people that aren't as technically savvy, right? Or, not as proficient in their roles. They're
Right.
the ones that gain the biggest benefit from, these generative digital assistant or generalized digital assistant tools like Copilot is. And so, if that's where the strongest ROI is, that's why it's so important and it's so tempting to just give like those, let's say you buy 400 licenses, right, of Copilot, because
Right.
you're right, it's multi-year. You give that to your super users and, like the people we've always relied on as champions, and you don't include a lot of these other types of users. If you don't include these other users, you're not really maximizing the return you can get.
Right.
And whether it's team-based nominations where you include these other people and then they're brought along for that journey with that super user being the resource that helps scale that across the team,
Hmm.
it doesn't change the fact that we need to incorporate them. So I always just remind myself of that because yes, the
Yeah. No,
promise
I
and
think it's good.
value, what we want is different than what we're getting, but at the same time, what we have is proving to have a really substantial impact on productivity, and it's
Right.
more pronounced for this subset of users. Yeah.
No, I agree. And one of the things I do say to a lot of companies is, unfortunately, Copilot doesn't have a clippy. It just doesn't pop up and say, "Hi, did you know that I could do this right now for you?" And prompting, which we saw a lot of it build, is
Yeah.
becoming a big thing. And I would love, I think, for companies that are trying to do this to look at prompting on what are scenarios that you would love to have folks adopt and create prompts to help them to find that and discover it and understand it. And that's really going to help, I think, to make a difference with that adoption, because a lot of times it's not that people don't want to use it. They just don't realize what it's capable of or what
Yes.
beyond just those five basic scenarios are the things that they should be looking at. So prompting is really a big aspect of this.
And there's this temptation for us to build prompt libraries and do all that. I think the trick really is two things. One, it's trusting that Microsoft's learning, right? The Mad Libs approach to prompting works well. You can see them
Yes.
using it in different places. There's evolution that's happening in that space, both industry wise and then of course at Microsoft. So that's exciting. I think the second one is we often think, oh, okay, well, just the out of the box experience is all people need. But when you ask a generalized question, you say like, what's the, when does travel budget due, or when do I need to do
Right.
this? Copilot can't answer that question because it has all this graph data and it doesn't know what to look at. And
Right.
so, we are responsible for calibrating Copilot via the use of plugins, custom Copilots, or SharePoint Copilots, or other tools so that it can help understand that. And part of that isn't just like, look here. When you ask about policies, look in this policy library or SharePoint site, right? Which is number one thing you're often doing is you're defining
Right.
these really simple plugins. But it's also the fact that in there, you can be like, when you use that plugin, here's the types of prompts that we can suggest for people. And so all of a sudden, you can take something like talking and working with policies or procedures, or you name it. Like I think of a common, again, I'm picking on business documents because we're a bit of a SharePoint
Yeah.
focus today. But like those types of prompts, you could actually define for people and show them it basically and write it. So I don't encourage, strong investment in prompt libraries. I think sharing in communities and stuff around prompt libraries is good in organizations, but I actually encourage all that energy to be towards these plugins or custom Copilots or SharePoint, whatever you want to call them, these Copilot layers where you add in, a little bit more of that journey design to
Right.
help people with whatever that sequence is that they're looking up. And surprisingly, when you do this, it goes back to those like population of users that aren't super users. They
Right.
really benefit from this because
Yeah.
they're trying to do these one or two, three actions, but they don't know how to do it in Copilot. And so we've sometimes shifted, especially when you're at like the third ring. You've done rollout of 50 and then 100 users, and now you're doing all these team-based nominations and adoption patterns. In those patterns, we often start to lean more towards these plugins because they're more consistent in terms of what they deliver, and they don't change. Like whereas
Right.
Microsoft's underlying capabilities keep evolving and becoming either better or slightly
Right.
different, this one doesn't. So when we scale it across those like I said, those average users, this is the kind of technique that we're leaning more and more on in the market. Is these plugins and extending Copilot. And when I say extending, that sounds like a bad thing. I'm not talking about Azure AI services, right?
Yeah.
Or even connecting to SAP or something. No, just like look at this area Copilot. When they ask for this, look over here, please.
Right.
That's where the content is. Yeah.
Richard, we got about 2 minutes left. Final thought on, Copilot wisdom for customers or things to think about. We've talked about the future of SharePoint. We could do a whole nother show on is Loop going to replace OneDrive and all this stuff. But what's your kind of final thought, closing thing for folks to keep in mind as they move forward?
I think sort of some people who have experience in SharePoint and the various elements of SharePoint. And I think a lot of those people, you have this really important critical part to play in both technical readiness and business readiness and, establishing success with Copilot,
Right.
especially as it scales. And the second thing is, if you're not one of those people and you're a new Copilot person, you're coming from Microsoft 365 from a different lens, SharePoint's one of those things you can't ignore. And so understanding the ways it connects and works with it is just as important, I would argue, if not more important, at least in the earlier stages, than understanding how it works with the Office applications. So, that would be my biggest takeaway is that, spend the time and energy learning about it. And then if you're a SharePoint person, figure out where those connection points are,
Right.
because they do matter. Yeah.
Love it. Awesome. Richard Harbridge. I encourage you to follow Richard on LinkedIn and all of his various socials. He puts out great content, and I appreciate you taking time out of your busy day to be here today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
No, absolutely. All right, everybody. Thanks from myself and Daryl, who just did another episode, which is going to be hitting next week. I want to thank all of you for checking us out here at Unplug IT, and we will see you all very, very soon. Take care.
Bye for now.